Hello, everybody. It's great to see you all. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Cynthia Hooper from the College of the Holy Cross, and welcome to a very special session of The World Reconfigured: Consequences of Russia's War on Ukraine.
And I am Steve Barnes from George Mason University. Really excited to have everybody here. Welcome certainly to our regular guests and to the many who are joining us for the first time. Cynthia and I devised this series last semester really to keep us all talking about the war, but also to broaden our understanding of this historical moment, which we see as one in which authoritarianism is challenging democracy around the world. I think our belief, among other things, is in the radical importance of expertise. And so we've invited a whole range of guests with a whole range of expertises over the course of this past academic year. And I have to say, when Russia launched its full-scale invasion on February 24th, 2022, I was really looking for somebody who could help me to understand the military component of the war. I will never pretend to be any kind of expert about things military. And I was spending my time on Twitter and on CNN and places like that. And that's when I found our guest for today, who has been so enormously helpful to me. I don't even know if he can realize how important he's been to people like me. But I think even better was then to realize that he speaks out often on precisely the contemporary challenge of authoritarianism around the world and here in our United States, something that has been a critical topic for Cynthia and I, definitely all year, but especially this semester. So today's guest is Lieutenant General Mark Hertling, who served in the U.S. Army for 37 years. He retired in 2013 as Commanding General of the U.S. Army Europe and the 7th Army. He has served in combat. He has carried out a wide variety of operational and training roles, and really sort of has lots of different types of expertise, I think, that he can bring to bear on helping us to understand this war. General Hertling is a West Point graduate with many advanced degrees, including, by the way, a doctorate in business administration. And he has served especially offering training and leadership for the medical profession since his retirement from the Army. With that, we'll follow our usual format, which is to ask General Hertling to speak to us for about maybe 10 minutes or so to give us some food for thought, some things to think about. Then Cynthia and I will ask some questions. We'll allow guests to raise your hands, and we'll acknowledge you and let you join the conversation, but you can also always add questions to our chat. And with that, Mark, I'd turn it over to you.
Okay, Stephen, thank you, and Cynthia, thank you as well. And before I begin, I just want to first of all, thank everyone that are all your students, as well as all the other visitors that are on the net this morning. But also, as we said prior to connecting this morning, I congratulated both Professor Hooper and Professor Barnes on the coordination between George Mason and Holy Cross, two great universities, and what they're doing beyond the normal classroom engagement with their students, and also opening this up to the community. So thank you both for first of all, being teachers, the most valued profession, and secondly, for just inviting me on here. What I told Cynthia and Steve I would like to do this morning to start is show about 6 slides, just to give sort of a preview of what I would like to talk about. So I'll throw those up here right now, if you all don't mind. If I can get this to work now. We practiced and it worked before. There we go. You know, if you're a retired general, you always have to start any kind of presentation quoting an old dead guy. And even though we're talking about what's going on in Europe, or at least that's what we'll start talking about, I'm sure we'll dive off into other topics. I'm going to kind of conjure up an important message from someone that I've always read and followed, and that's Sun Tzu, or Sun Tzu, a Chinese philosopher. And this is probably his most famous of all sayings. And we use this saying repeatedly in our training centers at Fort Irwin, California, at Fort Polk, Louisiana, and in Grafenberg, Germany, to remind training units what they have to do. It isn't just go on the battlefield and be amongst your enemy. It is actually understanding not only yourself and the enemy, but knowing the ground, the weather, and everything that's associated with the environment to help you win. And I'll start a couple of slides with that, and then introduce you to a couple of friends of mine. Well, friends and acquaintances, I guess, would be the better term to use. This is a picture taken in 2011 of me and a Russian interpreter and the chief of the Russian ground forces, a guy named Alexander Strykov. When I took command of U.S. Army Europe, and this was after serving there for 10 years prior to this picture being taken, General Strykov was the chief of the Russian ground forces. And he invited me to Russia to see what kinds of things they were doing with their military to get a closer cooperation between our two militaries. Now, this was not the first time I had been to Russia. My first trip to Russia was in 1996. I was a young lieutenant colonel, and I was asked to go along with a group called that was developing something called Partnership for Peace, which didn't truthfully turn out all that well. It was an attempt at bringing the United States and Russia closer together after the disestablishment of the Iron Curtain. But in the visit to the Russian forces, I learned many things, which we'll talk about later. But when it was time for me to offer a similar invitation to General Strykov, he came over for a 10-day period to visit U.S. Army Europe, and I escorted him around. These are the kinds of engagement that a lot of senior military leaders do consistently and constantly. During my visit to the Russian forces, it was a very dramatic agenda. I was taken to specific places. I watched specific, not training events, but demonstrations of capabilities. I visited barracks where Russian soldiers lived, saw their training base, inspected their motor pools, or at least parts of their motor pools. And I was told to take a lot of notes and pass them back to the intelligence community. And what I found in 2011 was something I had seen in 3 previous visits, that the Russian military was continuing to deteriorate. Their leadership was bad, from the junior level all the way up to the senior level. Their training was non-existent. What I saw on the training areas were demonstrations and not training events. And there's a huge difference between the two. Their equipment was in really bad shape. You know, they had the polished versions of tanks and BMPs and artillery pieces in displays for me, but I was able to kind of wander off into other parts of the motor pool and take a trainer's view of what I saw in the maintenance bays, and truthfully across the board in some of the palace guards units of the Russian military. They were in bad shape, and I reported that. But in this particular conversation, when General Strykov came to visit me, instead of giving him the agenda of where we would go, instead I gave him a list of things that U.S. Army Europe was doing throughout the continent of Europe. And I told him we had a plane and a helicopter and some cars at our disposal, and he could pick wherever he wanted to go. So he dutifully, with his staff, went down the list and said, hey, I want to go see tank gunnery and helicopter operations, and I want to visit a Department of Defense elementary school, and I want to see some of your housing areas. So he saw the whole spectrum of U.S. Army Europe. That's a long lead in to this picture. In this picture, you can see by the look on my face that I'm a little bit stumped. General Strykov had just said, General, we've now seen the U.S. Army in action over the last 10 days. Tell me how I can help my army be as good as yours. And that question floored me. And I thought for a second and then said, General, I don't think you can. You have a corrupt government. You have very poor leadership training. And it seems like there's a lot of corruption within your maintenance and your training, that people are taking money, defense money, away from the kinds of things you should be doing. And what I saw in my visit to Russia was more of a show as opposed to armies rehearsing. He paused for a minute, did not seem embarrassed at all, shook his head and said, "Thank you for your candor." And that was the last I heard from General Strykov. He went back to Russia. 6 months later, he retired. His replacement was a guy named Colonel General Andrei Churkin. Churkin came to one of our conferences where we used to do something called the Conference of European Armies. General Churkin came to our conference and was very engaging with the other chiefs of the various ground forces in Europe. There are 49 countries in Europe, and about 40 of them were at this conference. And seemed afterwards, I had a bilateral discussion with him, and he seemed very intent on continuing the relationship. Unfortunately, 6 months after that, I heard through intelligence channels that General Churkin had been arrested and jailed in a gulag for taking bribes from some of his subordinates. So it just reinforced my feeling that the Russian army was in bed. Now, those are just data points and anecdotal commentary, but it kind of reinforced what I believe was going on in the Russian military. So those are your enemies. Now here are your friends, or knowing yourself, as Sun Tzu told us to do. This was a picture at the Yavoriv Training Center, just northwest of Lviv. And it was the first time I met up with a guy named Hennady Vorobyov. And I will try this. If you can see my arrow, Hennady is this man right here. And you can see this individual was the equivalent of the chairman of the Joint Staff. And we were conducting an exercise with 16 16 nations, some of which were in NATO, some of which were not, at the Yavoriv Training Center that U.S. Army Europe was sponsoring along with the Ukrainian Army. In my first meeting with General Vorobyov, his name was Hennady Vorobyov, he asked me to call him Henny, so from then on I did. He presented me with his problem set, which was his desire to transform the Ukrainian army into a Western-style force. Now, this was in 2011, long before the Russians had invaded Crimea or the Donbass. And he realized at the time that he would face problems with the Russian army in the future. And the reason he told me he would was because from the time of him being a second lieutenant to the time of him being a lieutenant colonel, he was in the Soviet army. When Ukraine gained its freedom in 1991, he petitioned to go back to the Ukrainian army and become a member of their National Guard, the equivalent of their National Guard, rose through the ranks of 3-star general, and then became the commander of the ground forces. In every conversation I had with General Vorobyov after that, he was reminding me of the master's thesis and the doctoral thesis that he wrote that provided a context for the transformation of the Ukrainian army into a modern force. Now, unfortunately, in 2017, General Vorobyov died of cancer. He was a heavy smoker and a heavy drinker, obviously. And in fact, as part of our relationship, one of the benefits of being a senior commander in the U.S. Army is you have to eat and drink a lot for your country. And General Vorobyov and I had many nights where we would toast each other with either vodka or bourbon and have very good meals. But during that period of time, we became very good friends. And he asked for us to help him train his NCO Corps, to establish a training center at Yavoriv, to help. He asked me specifically to help him get more of his colonels into the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, because he wanted to replace the old guard in the Ukrainian army. Now, I'll stop there talking about him and just add one more comment. He was trying to stamp out corruption in the Ukrainian army, but he also knew that there was significant corruption in the Ukrainian government during this time. And in fact, the U.S. Army, and I'm sure Professor Hooper and Professor Barnes can comment more on this, but there was significant corruption in the Ukraine's government that existed through probably about 2016, and there are still patches of that in the government too, as President Zelensky has found. So that is knowing the enemy and knowing your friend or knowing yourself. Now we have to know the terrain. And I know all of you are students of Europe, and you know exactly where Ukraine is on the map, unlike most Americans. But I wanted to put this map up to remind people that this is a very large country. It is the size, or maybe a little bit bigger than the state of Texas. It's about 800 miles from east to west, from the Polish border to the Donbass. It is about 500 miles from north to south, if you count the autonomous Republic of Crimea up to the Belarusian border. And what you see in terms of roads, those red lines, and railroads, those black and white lines throughout the map, are the major logistics and what we call in the military communications arteries in the country. If you're not on a major artery, you're on usually a dirt road or a one lane or potentially two lane road. And as you'll see, the Dnieper River runs from up near Chernobyl in the north, and it exits the Black Sea down near Kherson in the south, but it bisects the country in two. And when you stood on the banks of the Dnieper River, like I have in some places, you understand that it's wider than the Mississippi or the Hudson. In some places, it's wider than a very large lake, as you can see near Hertling in the middle of the country. It is literally a lake that flows through that part of the region. So those kinds of terrain features will sometimes, and roads and networks and weather will dictate the kind of operations you can perform from a military perspective. And you can't forget that. Two more slides, if you don't mind. At the beginning of the campaign, on the 24th of February, as Steve mentioned, I am a CNN military analyst, and I was asked to come to New York to be in studio for about a week before the war started, because there was an anticipation of that. And being a big, their military analyst, I realized that in order to understand what the military was doing, I had to understand what the politicians were doing. So in my hotel room that night, I jotted down what I thought were Putin's strategic objectives of invading Ukraine. And this was before the war started, because truthfully, I didn't think he would do it. I didn't think Mr. Putin was dumb enough to invade Ukraine, because he had only established a force of about 190,000 soldiers around the outer perimeter of Ukraine, the half moon from the Belarusian border down to where the Azov Sea meets Russia. Now, 190,000 troops seems like a lot, but from a military perspective, when you're talking about the mission set that those troops would get, and an understanding that whenever you throw a number like 190,000 soldiers waiting to invade, that from a military battle math perspective, about half of those or less will be combat troops. Half or more, usually about 2/3, will be the support infrastructure for the combat troops. So when you look at that boundary, and I measured it with a little string, and it's about from the Belarusian-Russian border in the north down to the Azov Sea in the south, it's approximately 2,000 kilometers. So when you have a force of 190,000 attacking along a boundary of 2,000, you quickly weigh down the size of the force. You add to that the number of major cities that the Russian forces were asked to seize and secure. And in that in the eastern portion of Ukraine, there are at least 6 cities that I could count that I know have a population of over 1 million people. That drains your troops from what they're doing in combat to secure a city. So that 190,000 force with a battlefield math perspective really dissipates very quickly. So on the 24th of February, in studio on CNN, when everyone else was saying that Ukraine would be conquered within a couple of days, I shook my head and said, I don't think so, on the air, on a show that I probably shouldn't mention, but it was hosted by a guy with the initials of Anderson Cooper. And during the break, he asked me a question. He said, so General Hertling, you don't think Russia is going to conquer Ukraine? And I said, absolutely not. I said, I don't think they're going to get very far at all, because I know the enemy. I know the number of forces they have, and I also know the culture that's been developed within the Ukrainian force. You can contest these 5 strategic objectives that I say are Putin, because these are mine. The reason there's an asterisk at the top in the title is because I made these up, but they seem to go along with what Mr. Putin has attempted to do. Now, President Zelensky's strategic objectives, on the other hand, in my view, were these. And these have only been hardened after 15 months or more of combat. There has been the dynamic of creating even a stronger will among the Ukrainian people. And now I will shift from Sun Tzu to another theorist by the name of Karl von Clausewitz, who said you need 3 things to win battle. And that's a very good military, the support of the people, and an effective government. Ukraine has all 3 of those things. Russia is failing in each one. So that is sort of my introduction from a political standpoint. This is a map that I drew right as the campaign started that saw where the Russian forces were dispersed. And if you believe their main attack and Putin's priority was to replace the government of Kyiv, 3 of those arrows go right into the heart of the matter and take up the Clausewitzian concept of if you can take the capital, you will take the country. He was not able to take the capital. Putin was also not, in the encirclement in the east, not able to encircle the Ukrainian army. So he could not subjugate either the army or the population. So from this initial concept, the Russian strategy and operations began to break down. And that's where I will stop, and we can begin our Socratic dialogue, I think.
Well, we have a lot of questions to ask. I'm sure there's already been a lot of good ones coming in the chat. Definitely invite people to raise their hands, and we'll try to turn to you and get you an opportunity as well. I certainly want to ask some questions about sort of exactly where we're at right now and kind of what you see going forward. But I actually want to take one step back, and it's to draw in part on a question that we have in the chat from Vlodek. But you know, you going on CNN in the first couple of days and saying that they weren't going to be victorious actually seems to have been an unusual take, even among military experts at the time. And certainly many of those that I was reading and following led me to believe that this would be a Russian victory and that it would be relatively a quick one. And so, you know, Vlodek writes it this way: in view of your description of the Russian army, why did the West, including the United States, and I would say here perhaps maybe most other than you, why did they misjudge Russia's strength? Why did they think that this victory would come and come quickly? And why did you come at it differently than many who are also experts in your field? Yeah,
well, what I would say is the intelligence community did not get it wrong. But what I would suggest is the intelligence community, and I had to deal with this as the commander in Europe, because I was seeing the things that were posted by many in the intelligence community. Obviously, I can't talk about that, but you know, I would always read my daily intel book and say, yeah, I'm not sure they got that one right, or boy, that might need a little bit of adjustment. But a lot of intelligence is based on capabilities. So when you have the 4th largest army in the world, and you have the most tanks and most BMPs and a boatload of artillery, and your political leader is proclaiming that he has a missile force with both nuclear and conventional weapons that is devastating, and a huge air force, and you see demonstrations of capabilities. You know, the intelligence community looks at that in very intently. And sometimes you can't get into the corruption within the army. You only know that, hey, Russia is allowing X amount of rubles to be given to their defense department or their Ministry of Defense. And so, gosh, it's got to be going somewhere. And there's probably a little bit of grift, but you would think they're at least buying things. And you see the May Day parade, and you see tanks rolling across Red Square, and you say, well, this is a pretty powerful army. And oh, by the way, there's still a draft army, a force that is brought in once a year. So they have a huge potential for mobilizing a reserve. But you can't get into either the mind of Putin or the mind of his generals or the mind of the individual soldiers and say, how is their fighting capability? That is as the Germans call it, Fingergespitzegefühl, I think is the German word, where you have to have a feel for the fingertips. And that's really hard when you're an analyst trying to just see what's on paper or what the satellites or the intelligence is showing you.
So let me, before I let Cynthia jump in, just kind of get your sense of where we're at right now. So we've come off of a winter in which, to a lot of observers, it appears that we've been at something like stalemate. But at the same time, we know that there's been this incredibly bloody and violent battle going on around Bakhmut. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you see, or if you see importance in that battle. And whether you think that you know, we're on the cusp of some kind of Ukrainian counteroffensive, whether we're on the cusp of seeing some kind of Russian victories, just kind of how you look at and think about all of this, you know, and maybe to help us just to understand a little bit in what I think for most of us, it feels a little bit like the fog of war, right? We don't know exactly who to pay attention to. There are people telling us all kinds of different things. What is it that you're looking for when you're trying to understand what's going on, and just kind of your...
Yeah, that's a great question, Stephen. What I would say is there has been an almost shiny object focus on Bakhmut over the last 3 months. And what I would say, first of all, in that fight, yes, it has been incredibly bloody. But that is only one of about 30 battlefields that I could name as I'm watching it on a map that have been incredibly bloody over the last 4 months. Here's, if I can go back to the Sun Tzu quote again about knowing the terrain and knowing the weather. There's something, and both of you being Russian experts, I'm probably going to murder this name, but there's something called Rasputita, which means the Ukrainian winter. It is when the land turns to a swamp and it becomes a bog-like, and it's tough to maneuver through it. Well, the Russians chose the time of Rasputita to conduct their initial attack last February. You would have think they, you know, if not from history of World War II, when the Nazis tried it and didn't succeed, you would think that they would at least relearn the lesson of last February. Then you say, well, okay, what happened this February? Russia began another offensive during the time of Rasputita. I mean, are they not a learning organization, or are they just, you know, doing things repeatedly because people are telling them to do it? Ukraine, on the other hand, I think has fought a very good defensive fight over the last 4 months in what I would call their phase 5 of the operations. I don't want to go through the first 4 phases because I've kind of calculated the phases of the operations. But I believe Russians' offensive operations started not with a bang, but because they were forced to do it by Mr. Putin in very small packets. That's what's been happening since about September. And Russia has suffered greatly, in my view, while they have pushed bodies into the fight and used their missiles and artillery to attempt to destroy Ukrainian infrastructure and make it a harsh winter for the Ukrainian people. Ukraine, on the other hand, has defended very well. If you look at in the Army, we have a doctrinal definition of something called the active defense. It isn't a defensive operation where you say they're not going any further than this spot and establishing ground. It is the ability to move around and defend in different places. Ukraine has done that well. The challenge, they have done it well in the Donbass region. They have been assisted in that by the Dnieper River in Kherson. So they have a natural barrier in the southeast. So everyone has now been saying, the media and all the pundits have been saying, it will soon be a Ukrainian counteroffensive. I personally don't believe it will be a grand counteroffensive. I will believe that it will be various attacks in different regions that are going to be decidedly along a spectrum of difficulty. They will be conducted, these attacks will be conducted at the time and place of Ukraine's choosing, but it will start a new phase of this campaign, the new phase of this war that will be extremely difficult for Ukraine for two reasons. Number one, the defense is always easier than the attack. Number two, the Ukrainian generals have had to incorporate a massive amount of new equipment into their formations and conduct high-level training in combined arms operations. And not just combined arms operations, but something that we at the training centers at Fort Irwin, California, call a combined arms breach, which is breaching obstacle belts. It is, in my time at the various training centers, it is the one mission set that we give brigades and divisions to conduct that is the most difficult to conduct, and it creates the most casualties and has the potential for an unbelievable fight on both sides. Now, Russia, over the last 4 months, if you're counting from October, 5 months, have been increasing their dynamics of establishing defensive belts, minefields, dragon tooths, wire, fighting positions, all along the front lines in both the north and the south. The question, and I can't answer this because I don't have the ability to access intelligence, is how good are the soldiers manning those defensive positions, the Russian soldiers? Now, I'm now going to say something that's probably going to create some pushback on some of your listeners. At the beginning of this war, we believed the Russian forces were 10 feet tall, and they proved they weren't. Now, because of Ukraine's successes over the last year plus, we believe Ukraine is 10 foot tall, and they're not, in my view. They are a good army. They are not a great army. I heard one of my colleagues, an Australian major general, say the other day, they're the best army in the world. And to that, I say that's a bunch of bull. Ukraine has a good army. It is not a great army, because their ability to conduct large-scale combined operations with all the necessary elements of those combined arms operations that aren't available will hinder them in the next phase of this operation. But having said all that, and that's a very long, dialogue or monologue on my part, I do believe they will regain a significant amount of ground in their coming spring offensive.
Thank you so much, General Hertling, for being here. And thank you also for that last comment. I mean, I personally believe that it's so important to struggle to find a way to combine pragmatism and idealism in, analyzing this war that we all, many of us feel very passionately about. I would actually like to start off with a question from one of my former students. He was also a former captain in Afghanistan, and he's in military intelligence now. And he asked a related question, I think, about your opinions on the effect of U.S. training on Ukrainian troops at the start of the war, and also how well that pool of trained troops and associated capabilities has held up after more than a year of attritional fighting with high casualties?
Well, that is a great question, and one that I worry about today. First, the first part of the question, my evaluation of the Ukrainian forces at the beginning of the war. They had gone through, we had started something called the Joint Multinational Training Group Ukraine, JTMGU or JMTGU in Yavoriv, starting in about 2014, I think it was. The U.S. had built that training center into a more robust capability. And both the U.S. Army Europe, specifically the 173rd Airborne Brigade, and the California National Guard on a state partnership program, repeatedly trained Ukrainian units, but for a different purpose. The JMTGU was initially developed to help train Ukraine to be partner forces in Afghanistan. The Ukrainian army was part of something called the Pol-Uker Brigade in one of the provinces in Afghanistan, which I'm sure your former student knows, where the Polish and the Ukrainian had formed a singular brigade. I think it was in Helmand. I'm not sure which province it was. But you know, we were told by our counterparts in Afghanistan when I was commanding in Europe, hey, you need to help the Ukrainian forces train, or excuse me, all of the European forces that are providing units to ISAF to train up to the capability that they can go into the fight immediately, because we're finding forces coming from Europe that aren't ready for the Afghan fight. So part of the training center in Yavoriv was to do that. We began also training Ukrainian forces up to the level of company grade operations. So when you're talking company grade, you're speaking 100 soldiers in a unit. It didn't get higher than that. There were a few minor battalion level operations, and I would say battalions are anywhere from 300 to 500 soldiers, but not much. We did not get into the logistics training at Yavoriv. We did not get into very much other than, you know, assessing networks for terrorism strikes into the intelligence capability. Now, a counterintelligence fight, like what, or a counterterrorism fight or counterinsurgency fight in Afghanistan, excuse me, is very different than a conventional fight in Ukraine. So the transition from one type of fight to another is difficult. That's a long answer to the question from your former student, that whereas there was a leadership capability and a Western approach to command capability in the Ukrainian army at the beginning of the war, and that there was very good young soldiers, specifically sergeants. Ukraine has developed a professional NCO corps. That made the difference early on in the defense. I don't know what the casualty, and this gets to the second part of the question. I don't know what the casualty figures are of the Ukrainian forces. They are very good at basically suggesting what the Russian casualties are, but very few in the US government know what Ukrainian casualties are. So let's just say Ukraine has suffered a third, for argument's sake, a third of what Russia has suffered in this fight. That's probably conservative, but it's also about 80,000 soldiers. And those are frontline soldiers, and that's significant. The majority of those frontline soldiers were probably the ones that were trained in the training centers between the invasion in 2014 and the invasion in 2022. So I believe, truthfully, Ukraine has probably lost a lot of the trained soldiers that were there when the war started. At the same time, you know, I'm breaking away now from U.S. Army Europe to special operations. The special operations commander in Europe, multiple commanders in Europe, my counterparts, had trained special ops forces in all of Eastern Europe, Ukraine, Georgia, the Baltics. And I think the special operations in Ukraine are very good, and they have probably survived at a higher rate. So they continue to conduct operations in a good manner. that also contributes to what I was saying a little while ago about, with the force that will be conducting offensive operations is probably attrited significantly from the force that started the war. And that's probably not a good thing.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm going to also bring in another former student of mine who has his hand raised, who is a Fulbright Fellow, and he's joining us from Taiwan, actually. So Mitchell, it's great to see you. Thank you so much for being here at midnight and ask your question. And I just got a text from my co-host saying, please make all questions like as succinct as possible, because we're
and the general
super excited.
Making his answers as succinct as possible.
No, well, everybody's excited and they're great answers, great questions. So this is just wonderful. But anyway, Mitch, go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Hooper, and thank you, General, for joining us. So my question kind of goes to that aspect of attrition of trained forces you just mentioned. Given your extensive impact on training theory and procedures in the U.S., if you were a Ukrainian general on the ground right now, how do you balance or evaluate the pros and cons of training troops properly while fulfilling needs on the front lines? It seems like Ukraine is kind of stuck in this in between where they really struggle with the balance there.
Yeah, it's a great question. And Mitch, first of all, thanks for what you're doing in Taiwan. I would add to that, I've tried to put myself in General Zalewski's place and say, boy, what is the 3-star Ukrainian general contending with right now? He's contending with, reserves, getting coordination between his active force and the territorials. He's contending with a lot of brand new equipment and the supply chain associated with that. He's contending with the possibility of now 31 NATO nations helping him train his force, both individually and in combined arms units. And he has to establish a much better logistics process than he's had since the beginning of the war, because he's going to be moving right now. Plus, he has to determine an intelligence preparation of the battlefield of where do I attack and how. So that led me, I had a revelation the other night and said, man, I'm trying to think of this from the standpoint of a U.S. general. He's not thinking of it the way I am, because he has many more problems than I ever would in a conventional fight. So what I think he's going to do is probably adjust his offensive operations to use the kinds of things he's been given in a different way than the U.S. would use them. And plus, as I said before, he has the advantage of having an enemy that really, and I'm going to use a doctrinal term here, he has an enemy that really sucks being the doctrinal term. So if Russia is as depleted as we think they are, he can do more things. So what I think General Zalewski might be thinking about is very rapid advances in small areas to get behind the lines of the Russian forces and cause as much chaos as he can in the rear areas. We did that the United States did that in World War II in several instances. I mean, the history books will tell you about some of the units that were trained specifically to move at night. Oh, the other factor on this too is, and this is a small thing, but it kind of shows the dynamics of the battlefield. Ukraine has much more night vision capability than Russia does, but it isn't universal. So if there is a way to get a universal night vision capability to the Ukrainian forces, to these specific units that will go behind the line and create chaos, that's what I think I might be doing if I were a Ukrainian general right now. Now, I certainly don't know from intelligence where the best spots are to attack, but I know that President Zelensky's strategic objective is to regain territory and not give any territory up. And I think he probably wants to regain more territory in the southeast than he does in the Donbass in the short term, because that closes down Russia's ability to reinforce from Rostov-on-Don and the Crimea.
Steve, did you want to call on Fred? We've suddenly lost our audio.
Can you hear me
Fred,
now?
yeah, we can.
Yeah, Fred is part of our Osher lifelong learning community here at Mason. So it's great to see you, Fred.
Okay, thank you. The General, it was a fantastic talk you gave to us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
When in my youth, I was served in the a 8-inch towed outfit in Germany, and I was a battalion motor officer. So, and your comments about support is right on. And we were in the process of transitioning to new equipment. So we had a great range of equipment. What I'm asking about is, I see that there again, training at Grafenwehr, which I spent a fair time. But the thing was that what is looking like the Bradley, how does the U.S. support so that they can keep the parts and maintenance so it can be operational in what apparently it will be their center of their offensive in Ukraine? And so I'd like to ask you, how is that done?
Yeah, and that's a great question, Fred. And first of all, I got to state that if you were to go to Grafenwehr today, you would not recognize it. When I was the 1-star commander at Grafenwehr, the U.S. government put about $3 billion of construction into the place. It is no longer a mud pit. It is, in my view, the best place in the Army to serve. So you ought to go back there and check it out. But it has been my contention all along, and if you watch me on CNN, I have repeatedly said that logistics is the key to any equipment we give them. There's an old war college expression that says, well, there's 4 things that I learned in the war college. First of all, personalities matter. Secondly, you always take the high ground, whether it's physical or moral high ground, that words are important. You have to be precise. And number 4, logistics determine the art of the possible. Logistics will determine this fight. And truthfully, what I will say openly, because I have said it openly in the past, the logistics systems within Ukraine are not well developed.
Mm-hmm.
When you were an 8-inch artilleryman in Grafenwehr and you broke a part, you just ordered a part, and suddenly your division support command and your corps support command and your forward support battalion all got that part to you, and you probably complained because it took a week. But you had an infrastructure in place and a process to get that part to you or repair that piece of equipment. Ukraine does not have that. And when you're talking about going from an advance or going from I'll use T-72s as an example because I'm a tanker. Going from a T-72, which is the equivalent of a 57 Chevy, to a Leopard 2 tank, which is the equivalent of a Formula 1 racer. You sometimes can repair things, but most of the times you have to replace the parts that are broken inside the turret, inside the engine. And an M1A1 Abrams is even worse. So it is not just the ability to repair something. It is, as you pointed out, the ability to get the parts. How are they doing that? Which I think is the key part of your question. There are a lot of people in U.S. European Command who are attempting to help Ukraine establish a better supply line for all of the parts that they need. But I'll just add one more thing. Look at the number of types of equipment they have received. Leopard's tank, Gepards, AMX-3s, Patriot missiles. I mean, you can go down a laundry list of things that are all brand new to them that they don't have parts for and they don't know how to repair. And this isn't shade tree mechanic type stuff. I saw a thing on the internet the other day where a guy was saying, see how great the Ukrainians are. They're replacing the tube on a T-64 with a tube from a T-72. And my answer was, that's no big deal. They're both the same tube. And that's something you can do under a shade tree with a frame. You can't replace an M1A2 pack or power pack, an engine and a transmission, just by pulling it out under a shade tree and replacing a jet engine.
General Hertling, just to follow up on that, Mary in the chat and another friend of mine who's tuning in from Australia have been asking about artillery shells in particular. Last month, in one 2-day period, the Ukrainians used more rounds of artillery ammunition than the U.S. produces in 1 month. And there have been some news articles reporting that General Dynamics, which I understand is almost the sole provider of these artillery shells, is planning to increase its production, but that's something that takes a while to do. And so I was wondering if you had any thoughts on like how quickly this can be achieved and whether these kinds of lags are going to be problematic.
They are going to be problematic. One of the lessons the U.S. and most NATO nations are learning from this fight is our warfighting stocks are not adequate to sustain a high intensity conventional fight. I mean, that's just a lesson. Again, we could talk about artillery ammunition, and going back to Fred, as an 8-inch artilleryman, he probably knows the term I'm going to use called CSR. That means controlled supply rate. And it is what artillerymen know that they can't exceed on a daily basis, or else they will run out of ammunition. And in fact, both Russia and Ukraine have reverted back sort of to the Soviet model of shooting as much stuff as they can, and their targeting procedures are not as good as they should be. So there's a lot of rounds going out of the tubes, but they're not being as precise as they should be. Now, Ukraine is learning from the use of Gimlers, the guided missile or guided artillery rounds that shoot from the HIMARS, that they can hit one target with one round. That's very different than just having area fire with artillery pieces. And it is draining the supply systems of all of the NATO nations that are supporting Ukraine right now.
Let me jump to my history colleague here at George Mason, Meredith Lair. She's a professor of U.S. military history, and I invited her especially to be here today, so I want to let her jump in.
Well, thank you for that, Steve. And thank you, Steve and Cynthia, for creating this opportunity, and General Hertling for being with us. I think that maybe this is going to be a comment masquerading as a question, and it definitely piggybacks on a question that just popped up in the chat. So I'm thinking here about, well, I'm persuaded from your analysis of the Russian army that this war is going better for Ukraine, and I'm optimistic about a good outcome for Ukraine. But if the war is going so well for Ukraine, then why am I so terrified? And the answer is that the only thing scarier to me than a Russian victory is a Russian loss, because Putin still has cards to play. And it feels a lot like backing a wild, dangerous animal into a corner. And I'm also concerned about the rhetoric of the conflict, some of which even appears in Steve and Cynthia's framing of this event as a contest between authoritarianism and democracy. The Cold War binary between good and evil, I do not think served U.S. foreign policy well in the 50s and 60s, because it closed off options that were presented as kind of catering to evil. And so, if we cast this as a Manichaean struggle between good and evil, then are we limiting our ability to achieve some kind of peaceful or diplomatic resolution? So those are my comments here. And then I think someone in the chat asked it most succinctly, how do you see it ending?
First of all, great commentary, and it's always tough. You guys are ambushing me by giving questions to a professional historian. I'm going to be in trouble now. You're right. I agree with you, having studied the Cold War in the 50s and 60s and lived some of it in the 70s, that there was that binary. And I don't think that ever serves our national security well. But it is a way to get people on board, and that's part of the political view of things. If I can comment on the good versus evil, though, in this fight, in my view, it is an authoritative, kleptocratic government of a dictator attempting to do a land grab of a sovereign country in an age that I think imperialism probably should be long behind us. Okay, we can park that over here, but then go into the good versus evil in terms of what the Russian forces from a military and a government perspective have been trained to do. The just extreme violations of the 4 protocols of the Geneva Convention, the killing of civilians, the specific targeting of civilian infrastructure, schools, hospitals, electric plants, all violations of a law of war that was established in the 1800s, first of all, and now it was revamped in 1947. The kidnapping of children from parents, all of those, in my view, are criminal acts. They are evil. And just like Hitler and his group of people were held accountable in the Nuremberg trial, I believe The Hague has to hold Putin's ministers and his generals accountable for the kinds of military operations that they have conducted. So there is both the imperialistic land grab, but then the tone and tenor of modern combat that they have applied, that it really does lead back to a good versus evil approach. And then I'm going to go to your third comment about I agree with you that what is worse than a Russian win is probably, what could be worse than a Russian win is a Russian loss or a Russian draw. I'm very concerned, as all of you who are students of European history know, there are currently 5 different locations in Europe that are considered frozen conflicts. And every day, as the commander of U.S. Army Europe, I would get an intel book that would tell me the latest of what was going on in Transnistria, in Nagorno-Karabakh, in South Ossetia and Abkhazia, and in Crimea and the Donbass. And I would see that what Putin has done is created a no man's land of continual conflict that democratic forces and governments had to watch very carefully. If Mr. Putin is allowed to take a bite out of a sovereign country with territorial outlines, it violates the UN Charter, it violates the law of land warfare, it is an unjust war, and if he's allowed to keep that bite as part of a peace treaty, I think it will create problems in the future. That's also a very long answer to a very good question. So the final one is, I'm going to give you my best military answer to your question of how does this end? I don't know. I don't know.
Let me jump to Terry real quick. Newton, I promise I haven't. Please go ahead. Go ahead.
If I could add one more thing, I not only don't know, but it could also happen today, or it could happen years from now, and anywhere in between when it ends.
I'm going to jump to Terry real quick. Newton, I promise I haven't forgotten you. Terry has to go in just a moment, so I want to let him jump in. But I promise, Newton, we're going to get back to you. Terry, go ahead.
Well, General Hertling, I wanted to thank you, first of all, for sharing your deep wisdom and experience in this area. I am myself, I was 30 years in uniform as an Army military intelligence officer and still work as an Army civilian as an intelligence officer. So I've kept my hand in the game.
Thank you for that.
I have a main question. If you have time for a secondary question, that would be great. But my main question is, could you discuss the effect of the war on the Russian elite forces, like the paratroopers, the Desantniki, the Marines, the Morskaya Piechota, and to a certain degree the Spetsnaz? Because when you have a problematic regular force, there tends to be an over-reliance on the elite forces. And it seems like they've been decimated, burning out, and in some cases rebelling. In one famous case, a paratrooper major defected and shared his war diary with the world. Secondary question, and just if you have time, is just a word on the role of the National Guard State Partnership Program, which actually goes back to 1992. And I was struck in the very beginning of the war that the Ukrainian Air Force made a point of saying that the training with the California Air National Guard gave them the resilience that they showed at the beginning of the fight.
Yeah, those are both great questions, Terry. Thank you. The first thing I'll say from an elite forces standpoint, you aren't elite just because you say you are, I guess. That would be my first answer. I had a chance to work in my early days, back when I was a lieutenant colonel. I had a chance to be with some Spetsnaz soldiers in 1996. They weren't even close to being elite. They were pretty bad, actually, in terms of field craft, discipline. And you know, they would wear the blue and white T-shirts and appear to be part of the group, but they weren't that good in terms of soldierly field craft. That's my assessment. What we've seen in some of the early battles, especially the Battle of Hostomel, which I think the Ukrainian government is now taking on the road to different facilities. In fact, they're doing a piece at Fort Bragg, South Carolina, Fort Bragg, North Carolina, this summer, where they're bringing some equipment from the Battle of Hostomel Airport and showing how the battle took place. And I think our Fort Leavenworth is going to get involved in producing lessons learned from that. What you'll see, the performance of the elite forces across the board have not been very good at all. One of the things I was watching early on in the war was the potential for an amphibious operation in Odessa, which never occurred. They had close to 15,000 naval infantry, special naval infantry, Marines, if you will, in amphibious ships riding around in the Black Sea, and they never used them. I don't know why. I think it's because they realized they could not conduct an appropriate amphibious landing in Odessa, but that's just a guess on my part. So that's my take on special ops in the Russian army. They're better than the normal forces, but that really, in my view, doesn't give them much. And they are, for the most part, not career or professional soldiers. They just volunteer to go into those, parachute units or special Spetsnaz units or others, just to get the extra pay. I mean, sort of like our forces do in the initial part, but then they are built to be an elite force. I just don't see them as being elite as we've always thought they were. And I'm sorry, I forgot the second question real quickly.
I was just asking about the, noting the role of the California National Guard, and particularly the Air Guard, and having prepared
the state partnership program, which many people don't know about. Every single National Guard in the United States has a state partnership with some other country where they go for their active duty period to train and do some things. It was California in Ukraine. For me, the only other one I can remember in terms of the link up was the state of Georgia had a partnership with Georgia, so that was easy for a dumb guy like me to remember. But the Air Guard partnership was also significant, even though I don't think it got into the depth. They were able to discuss tactics, weaponry, and the ability to use different command and control mechanisms with the Air Guard. And my counterpart in USAFE, U.S. Air Force Europe, was a guy named Mark Welsh, General Mark Welsh, who was a phenomenal partner. He became the Air Force Chief of Staff, and he really drove that program very hard, as I did with the ground forces.
Thank you very much.
General Hertling, just to push you a little bit on the answer that you gave to Meredith a minute ago, when you seem to rule out even the idea of, say, allowing Russia to maintain possession of Crimea in order to bring this war to a close sooner rather than later. I just wondering kind of two things that have been touched on in the chat and also are important to me. But first of all, is inside the U.S. military, isn't there a level of division there? I mean, we've given $76.8 billion to Ukraine this year, 46.6 of that for military related expenses, and I think there is a growing sense that that level of aid is not sustainable year after year, especially when we normally, I mean, our biggest aid recipients in a normal year are like around $3 billion. But also, we're wondering, Steve and I were talking before before you joined us about whether or not U.S. military is sort of gaming out a situation where there could be like a political change in the United States and where there's like a shift in attitudes towards the importance of supporting this conflict, although that's probably a little bit unlikely. But just finally, you in your opening comments said that Russia is failing in 3 critical areas you identified as necessary to winning battles. And that's true. And I hear you. And as someone who's like studied Russian literature, I couldn't believe in that first month alone. There's so much literature about the dangers of the Russian mud in the spring that I just didn't understand how like Russian forces could get caught in the mud that they've all been reading about since they were kids in school. So there's been incompetence and disorganization from the very beginning in the part of the Russian military. But I've also been surprised in a very troubling way by a certain amount of strength, at least domestically. Like the regime is not looking nearly as weak as I might have anticipated. I mean, there have been workaround with like with some of the sanctions so that there's money coming in to keep fighting the war. And although there are issues like with getting arms and things like that, there's not like an immediate danger of economic collapse. And there seems to be like a politics of normalization going on in the major cities. I mean, there's not any sort of option to Putin. Even the oligarchs that are, taped in phone calls, cursing the war, sort of don't want to see Russia lose it. So I'm just wondering, is there like a strength to this, disgusting, careless with individual life kind of force that's there that is also sort of very dangerous and threatening? Like, do they actually have power to kind of go the distance if you don't care about things like the life of an individual soldier?
Yeah, well, there was an advertisement on the internet this morning with Mr. Prigozhin, who was standing in front of a cemetery trying to recruit more soldiers for the Wagner group. And his tagline was, "You can't live forever, come join us." That's kind of different than be all you can be. But,
well, and that's interesting too. Excuse me for interrupting, but the Ukraine is running a counter campaign to try to get Russian soldiers to defect.
Yes.
That's called something like "You Want to Live." Right.
And it has been somewhat successful, smaller scale. I'm not, I'm hindered by experiences, and you both and many of your students have studied the Russian culture. I hearken back to an anecdote that I'd like to tell. When I was commander at Grafenberg, actually, I went to church one Sunday morning, and one of the staff officers came up to me, who I also found out was the Boy Scout leader, the troop leader of the Boy Scouts. And this was in 2005. And we were having the yearly Torgau exercise, Torgau being the place on the Elbe River where the U.S. and the Russian forces linked up during World War II. So we would have an exercise every year where Russia would come over and we'd do something, in the training center. And it was great, mostly for, not just the training, but the drinking and the partying afterwards between the Russians and the Americans, kind of like the scene from Patton where everyone was dancing. And this Boy Scout leader came up to me and he goes, "Hey, sir," he says, "I know you've got the Russians coming next month." He said, "We have an Eagle Scout who took on as a project the renovation of the Russian graveyard." I said, "What the hell are you talking about?" He says, "Well, there's a Russian graveyard behind the fitness facility here at Grafenberg." And I said, "You're kidding me?" And he goes, "No, from World War II, it was a prisoner of war camp. So there was about 250 Russians buried there." And he said, "This Eagle Scout for his Eagle Scout project is going to clean this place up. Would you like to bring the Russian general to this graveyard?" I said, "Boy, that'd be great." So sure enough, we did this and scooted up there with the general and came out, and we got out of the car and I showed them, and the Boy Scouts explained what they had done. And it was beautiful that they had cleaned it all up and trimmed it back. And he just stood there like this with a scowl on his face. So I kind of pushed the issue. I was a 1-star at the time. And I said, hey, would you like to congratulate the scouts or anything for taking care of these graves? And he goes, no. He says, these are not true Russian graves. I said, really? What do you mean? He goes, if they were truly Russians, they would not have surrendered to the Germans. These must be from the smaller Soviet nations. What do you say to that? But that was the culture of, these lives, or the memory of these, are not worth it. Now, as you all know, there's a big deal in Russia of new brides in Moscow putting a bouquet of flower on the tomb of the unknowns to remember the however many millions of people that died in World War II. But is there that cultural dynamic that lives on? I'm not sure it is there. And the Russian winter is very cold and very harsh.
So Newton, I appreciate your patience. I'd like to turn to you. Newton is one of my senior auditors here at George Mason. Newton also turned 90 during the course of our semester together. So Newton, go ahead.
Thank you, Steve. General, I served in the 7th Army in West Germany in the 1950s. I was a finance clerk, 8th Evacuation Hospital in Bad Kreuznach at Landstuhl. So,
well, Newton, first of all, I have to say I commanded the 7 steps to hell, and we probably didn't have soldiers as good as you were back in those days.
and the other thing, I don't know if you can see that I have a Ukrainian map, and I cannot find Bakhmut. It must be a very, very small place.
It is. It's a city of about. It's a city of about 30,000, and it has their main industry is salt mining. There are indicators that Mr. Prigozhin specifically wanted to get several of the cities in that area, primarily for the economic purposes of obtaining salt from the salt mines, which is somewhat bizarre, but it's also part of the strategic objective, I guess.
Also, today's online edition of the New York Times has a detailed map of what is going on in the eastern part of Ukraine. You should take a look. It was very difficult for me to follow it, but I'm sure people would be interested. It's the online edition of today's New York Times. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you, sir.
Thanks so much, Newton. Let me ask a question from the chat, and it really relates to quite a few questions that we have gotten and that I'm sure you get all the time. Here we have, on behalf of a 19-year-old, this is from Ashley Duffany, on behalf of a 19-year-old Ukrainian, Oleg, who is on the call, he would like to ask, he said, my parents were in Irpin, Ukraine a week ago, and now Ukraine looks very terrible. Russia definitely has better aviation and Ukraine needs it. Should the USA supply planes, and how long do you think the USA will help Ukraine in this war? And I would say we've gotten all kinds of questions along the way. And like I say, I'm sure you do, about whether the US should supply ATACMS, whether there should have been provided the Iron Dome, whether the skies should be closed. And I know I've followed you over these last months and seen you write about issues like this. And so I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about this question of what weapon systems are supplied, and when they are supplied, and the challenges that go along with that.
Yeah, and I think I know Oleg. He is a new immigrant to the United States, and it's good to have you here, Oleg. In fact, I just wrote him earlier today. He's living with a teacher friend of mine, and his family is coming too. But I think it's the same one. What I will say is a couple of things. First of all, emotionally, the United States citizens of the United States want to give everything possible to the Ukrainians that can help them win. Emotionally, we all want to do that. But as I learned from studying Aristotle, you have to apply logic and reason as well. I guess I had this question about, I'll use the F-16s as the example. I had the question in an audience a few months ago about why aren't we giving them F-16s? And I said, how many would you like to give? That was my response. And as many as they need. Okay, well, General Zalewski said they need about 150. Okay, then we should give them 150. Okay, that's great. How many F-16s are in an F-16 squadron? There are 14 in an F-16 squadron. I'm doing battlefield math here for you. I said, do you know what those 14 aircraft cost? Just the cost of the airplanes, not the bombs, not the parts, not the fuel, not the training. About $4 billion for 14 of them. And when you talk to pilots, they will tell you it takes about 6 weeks to become oriented on an F-16 and another 6 months to get well trained enough to conduct missions. Then the question is, what mission do you want them to conduct? Do you want them to conduct close air support of ground forces or combat air patrol against missiles that are incoming? Well, we want them to do both. Okay, well, that's why the United States has schools like Top Gun. So we can train people to do that. And that's a very long school process to train people to do it. Now I'm building the house around this. So when someone says we should give 140 F-16s to Ukraine, or even 3, it's costly and it takes a lot of training. The context is this, Stephen. I believe most people think that if we were to provide M1A2 tanks, F-16s, name that tune, you know, Los Angeles submarines, I don't care, that immediately you put Ukraine in the seat, Ukraine soldiers in the seat, and they would have a Desert Storm-like experience, and this war would be over in 3 days, 4 days. That's not how it works. The U.S., we did an unfortunate thing in winning that war in Desert Storm in 4 days. Now everybody believes that's the standard. This is combat. You train years for this. And President Zelensky, rightfully so, he wants other nations to give him an entire army and an entire air force. And if the entire air force is given, he would probably next ask for an entire navy. And as Cynthia pointed out, we have already provided $76 billion worth of equipment to Ukraine. And that's compared to the $3 billion that Ukraine spent on their own defense in 2021. So you kind of see the issue is the president of Ukraine wants an army, a modern air force, a modern navy, and you just don't do that in the time of war without paying a whole lot of money and training forces to use that equipment.
Thank you so much. I think next we'll go to Yuri Savchenko, who I believe is in the Finnish reserves.
Well, good evening. As I'm joining from Finland, it's 8:00 p.m. here. So
congratulations on being a part of NATO, Yuri.
Thank you. Thank you. It feels great. Well, there must be, it's delighted to hear your thoughts again, sir. And there's probably a million questions I'd like to ask. Yes, I'm a captain in the Finnish Army Reserves. And the one question I would like to ask you is that a year ago, when this full-scale attack started, we were baffling, wondering like why the Russians are not fighting as their doctrines say they should be fighting. And later on, we saw them kind of when they got kicked in Kiev, and they kind of came back to their original, strong artillery, just flatten everything and then advance. Now, I would like to ask you if you have, because you have provided a lot of insight for the leadership, explaining the difference between in Ukrainian army nowadays and the Russian. But I would like to ask about the doctrine in the Ukrainian armed forces. How do you see it today? Are their doctrine already solid, and is it mature, or are they still learning everything?
That is a great question, Yuri, and thanks for that. And yes, you're right about the Russian military. There's a problem when you don't, they tried to develop the battalion tactical groups and a new way of warfare that was that got away from the echelonment of forces, of driving to a location and then having a follow-on force take over from there. They just did not do that. And I think they were deterred by the fact that they tried to develop battalion tactical groups. In terms of the Ukrainian army, their doctrine was being developed. This is a thing that General Vorobyov, who I mentioned at the very beginning, was attempting to do. He realized that there are 5 elements of modernizing an army: personnel, acquisition of equipment, training, leader development, and doctrine. If you're trying to transform a force, those are the 5 areas you focus on. Doctrine not only has to be written, but then has to be rehearsed and practiced and used as part of training. The U.S. military has just a wealth of doctrine. We could fill shelves with our doctrinal manual. As a trainer at the U.S. Army Training Center, one of the things that I used to have to do in training other forces was to show them what our doctrine said versus what they were doing and failing with. So it's a constant requirement to train with your doctrine in mind. And the bottom line, to answer your question, I think Ukraine is in the very early stages of doctrine development, but they haven't had the chance to really exercise and train it and rehearse it before major operations. But they are fine-tuning that doctrine because of what they're learning in combat, which is always a good thing.
To shift focus for a second to the issue of what the Ukraine conflict means for other countries, I just want to take a question from the chat from one of my current students, an international student from China. And he asks, on an international level, do you think Ukraine is standing as an example for other disadvantaged regimes facing threats from larger hegemonic powers? Is Ukraine giving confidence to those disadvantaged? And I think that that is a question also in my mind. Is global support for Ukraine like an exception, or again, is it showing a pattern of how we're prepared to help small countries stand up to oppression?
Yeah, I think it is showing an approach, especially, and it gets back to the question about good versus evil during the Cold War. Ukraine has a righteous cause. They are defending their people and their sovereign territory against a regime that is trying to kill their people, kidnap their children, and take away their sovereign territory. So the democratic nations of the world, I think, fall in behind the support of a nation that's being oppressed. It's like countering a bully in school. So I think, yes, that there are applications in other nations around the world for those countries or small regions that are trying to form democratic republics against those who are maybe trying to intimidate or have imperialistic tendencies. And it's interesting that you mentioned the question is coming from China and the situation there. But I would give a warning because I don't think the Chinese army and the People Liberation Army, the Chinese military, is equivalent to the Russian army, even though it's a dictatorship and an autocratic regime. I don't believe we see the same kind of grift and corruption in China that we've seen in Russia over the last several decades because of the leadership.
So we're really quickly running towards out of time, but I want to ask you this. So, I arranged this series of lectures back in the fall where I asked historians to come and talk about how history can help us understand the present. How our understanding, and Cynthia and I are, of course, both historians and history professors, and we wanted to think sort of carefully about how we use history to understand the present. And as I started, and this was part of a class that I was teaching, as I started to look into this question of how people use the past to understand the present, one of the things that I came back to again and again was the realm of the military, where I think it is done more explicitly and more consistently than in almost any other sphere. And so I was just wondering your sort of observations about military history, or perhaps even questions beyond military history itself. What is there in history that has helped you to try to make sense of this war and of where we sit at this moment in our history? And here, by the way, I just push back a little bit in terms of Meredith and how she's talking about how we frame this series. I think we are extremely well aware of how authoritarianism is a challenge in the United States right now as well. And so I'm just curious sort of your thoughts about history and how you think about history, or whether there's specific moments in history that you think about when trying to understand this moment.
Yeah, the study of leadership in the military, the doctrinal manuals on leadership says that we have to rely, that the leadership development is really a three-legged stool, that it is, you contribute to it by going to the schoolhouse, which those in the military do every couple of years at different ranks as you proceed up the ladder of responsibilities. So it's what you learn in the schoolhouse, number one. It's number two, what you learn in your operational assignments, to sit back and assess how you have done things and how you could have done it better, but also how you may polish the things that you did do well. But then the third area is self-learning. And it is the requirement. It's not an option when you're in the military. It is the requirement to read and study and learn. And that's usually, everyone devolves to history. And that's fun for me. I like history. I'm an amateur historian. I like to visit battlefields and see how people did things, because I think it's a classic responsibility to understand how people engage one another, both in conflict and in non-conflict operations. But it's also other things. And you can garner knowledge from any type of book that is a historical precedent, that describes a different time, that what people are thinking. And if it helps you avoid the scar tissue of life, and you say to yourself, hey, I'm not going to do that because it was a failure back then you've gained from history. That's hard to do, but you never will gain if you don't read and you don't study history. When I was commander of U.S. Army Europe, I was given a choice. There were budget cuts going on, and we would have quarterly meetings, and we would have staff rides 3 times a year to various European battlefields that I got to take my leaders on. And I asked, what would I give up, the quarterly meetings or the staff rides? And I said, no, we got to do the staff rides. So I gave up 2 of the quarterly meetings, made them biannual, and continued to do the staff rides. Because we had soldiers and leaders going into combat in Afghanistan and Iraq, and I wanted them to learn what leaders did in Anzio and Normandy and Saint-Lô and Tunisia and all the places where we could walk the battlefield and talk about decision-making. It wasn't about making them historians. It was about helping them understand leadership and decision-making and what created the best possible solution. So in the physician leader course that I now teach, that I started teaching here in Orlando, I asked the hospital to give me extra money so I could take the 50 physicians and nurses and administrators to Gettysburg. And so we fly up there once a year, and I assign each one of them a Civil War general on both sides. And it's not because I want to make them Civil War button collecting collection historians, it's because I want them to understand the dynamics of decision-making, toxic leadership, the importance of communication, the ability to be at the right place at the right time, how people interact. And they say that is the most religious experience that they've experienced as physicians, is to understand someplace they had never gone before and see how that plays a part in their leadership. So you can pick up any book. I'm currently reading a book on how Ike led, and I'm also reading a book over here that someone asked me to blurb that is fascinating. It's called Generals and Admirals, Criminals and Crooks. And it talks about toxic leaders. And I'm reading this book and saying, whoa, yeah, this is what's plaguing us in our military today with a small percentage of our senior leaders. So those are the kind of things, Stephen, and I'm sorry, I'm rambling again. That's what old generals do. But important to study leadership, to study history, to study social science and science writ large, to become a Renaissance person, I guess.
Thank you so much. I mean, I have to say, as someone who studied Stalin and terror during the Stalin era, I think it's really important to try to understand how toxic leadership can be successful for certain periods of time, right? I mean, what is it about dynamics of power and human nature that allows that to happen, right? I mean, so that we can construct institutions and societies that are more difficult.
If I may, Cynthia, on that subject, I ask a question to my physician leader class on one of the first lessons. I say, how many of you have ever worked for a toxic leader? All of the hands. And then I ask a follow-on question. I said, okay, that's great. So all of you have worked for toxic leaders. How many of you are toxic leaders? No hands raised.
Right.
And I say that can't be possible, that there's so many out there and none of them are in this classroom. So all of us have that tendency that we have to improve on leadership.
Well, I drew the short stick today, and it's my responsibility to bring this session to a close. General Hertling, we are so very grateful your incredible generosity of time today, but of course for your amazing career of service to our country. Thank you so very much. Just to our audience, remember next week back at our usual time, 1 o'clock, we're going to have Vance Serchuk, who's the executive director of the KKR Global Institute in New York. He's a specialist in geopolitical analysis and national security, and he'll probably be talking about security threats beyond this war, sort of, and what we might be facing in this changing world going forward. So it should be a great companion piece to this fantastic afternoon we've enjoyed today. Thanks to all of you who are tuning in from around the world. And again, thanks to our guest for offering us the benefit of his experience and insight.
Sir, thank you so much. It was a tremendous honor. I could really listen to you ramble for hours. We have so many questions we didn't get to, so many questioners we didn't get to. We appreciate all of you being here, and especially you, General Hertling. Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure, my honor. Thank you both for what you're doing for so many to help them understand our world. Appreciate it.
Take care, everybody.
You got it.